A mandolin is a musical instrument in the lute family and is usually plucked with a plectrum or pick. It commonly has 4 courses of doubled metal strings tuned in unison, although 5- and 6-course versions also exist. The courses are normally tuned in a succession of perfect fifths. It is the soprano member of a family that includes the mandola, octave mandolin, mandocello and mandobass. There are many styles of mandolin, but 3 are common: the Neapolitan, a round-backed mandolin, the carved-top mandolin and the flat-backed mandolin. A round back has a deep bottom, constructed of strips of wood, glued together into a bowl. The carved top or arched top mandolin has a much shallower arched back, and an arched top, both carved out of wood. The flat-backed mandolin uses thin sheets of wood for the body, braced on the inside for strength in a similar manner to a guitar. Each style of instrument has its own sound quality and is associated with particular forms of music. Neapolitan mandolins feature prominently in European classical music and traditional music. Carved-top instruments are common in American folk music and bluegrass music. Flat-backed instruments are commonly used in Irish, British and Brazilian folk music. Some modern Brazilian instruments feature an extra 5th course tuned a fifth lower than the standard 4th course. Other mandolin varieties differ primarily in the number of strings and include 4-string models such as the Brescian and Cremonese, 6-string types such as the Milanese, Lombard and the Sicilian, and 6-course instruments of 12 strings such as the Genoese. There has also been a 12-string type and an instrument with 16 strings. Much of mandolin development revolved around the soundboard. Pre-mandolin instruments were quiet instruments, strung with as many as 6 courses of gut strings, and were plucked with the fingers or with a quill. However, modern instruments are louder, using 4 courses of metal strings, which exert more pressure than the gut strings. The modern soundboard is designed to withstand the pressure of metal strings that would break earlier instruments. The soundboard comes in many shapes, but generally round or teardrop-shaped, sometimes with scrolls or other projections. There is usually 1 or more sound holes in the soundboard, either round, oval, or shaped like a calligraphic F. A round or oval sound hole may be covered or bordered with decorative rosettes or purfling. History. Mandolins evolved from the lute family in Italy during the 17th and 18th centuries, and the deep, bold mandolin, produced particularly in Naples, became common in the 19th century. Early precursors dating to around c. 13,000 BC, a cave painting in the Trois Frères cave in France depicts what's believed to be a musical bow, a hunting bow used as a single-stringed musical instrument. For the musical bow, families of stringed instruments developed, since each string played a single note. Adding strings added new notes, creating bow harps and lyres. In turn, this led to being able to play dyads and chord. Another innovation occurred when the bowharp was straightened out and reduced to lift the strings off the stickneck, creating the lute. First lutes. The plucked family of stringed instruments included lute-like instruments in Mesopotamia prior to 3000 BC. A cylinder seal from c. 3100 BC or earlier shows what is thought to be a woman playing a stick lute. The Mesopotamian lutes developed into a long variety and a short. The line of short lutes was further developed to the east of Mesopotamia, in Bactria and Gandhara, into a short, almond-shaped lute. Persian Barbat, Arab Oud Andalusia. Bactria and Gandhara became part of the Sasanian Empire. Under the Sasanians, a short almond-shaped lute from Bactria came to be called the Barbat or Barbud, which was developed into the later Islamic world's Oud. When the Moors conquered Andalusia in 711 AD, they brought the Oud along into a country that had already known a lute tradition under the Romans. The Pandura, During the 8th and 9th centuries, many musicians and artists from across the Islamic world flocked to Iberia. Among them was Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn Nafi, a prominent musician who had trained under Ishaq al-Mausili in Baghdad and was exiled to Andalusia before 833 AD. He taught and has been credited with adding a fifth string to his oud and with establishing one of the first schools of music in Córdoba. By the 11th century, Muslim Iberia had become a center for the manufacture of instruments. These goods spread gradually to Provence, influencing French troubadours and trouviers and eventually reaching the rest of Europe, from Sicily to Germany. Beside the introduction of the lute to Spain by the Moors, another important point of transfer of the lute from Arabian to European culture was Sicily, where it was brought either by Byzantine or later by Muslim musicians. There were singer-lutinists at the court in Palermo following the Norman conquest of the island from the Muslims, and the lute is depicted extensively in the ceiling paintings in the Palermo's Royal Cappella Palatina, dedicated by the Norman King Roger II of Sicily in 1140. His Hohenstaufen and grandson Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, continued integrating Muslims into his court, including Moorish musicians. By the 14th century, lutes had disseminated throughout Italy, and probably because of the cultural influence of the Hohenstaufen kings and emperor, based in Palermo, the lute had also made significant inroads into the German-speaking lands. European lute beginnings. A distinct European tradition of lute development is noticeable in pictures and sculpture from the 13th century onward. As early as the beginning of the 14th century, strings were doubled into courses on the miniature lute guitar used throughout Europe. The small zigzag-shaped soundhole became a round soundhole covered with the decoration. The mandola appeared in the late 16th century, and the mandolino, a Baroque mandolin, in the 17th century. Development in Italy. Birth of Neapolitan mandolin. The mandola was not a final form, and the design was tinkered with wherever it was built. The Italians redesigned it and produced the mandolino, a small catgut-strung mandola with 4, 5 or 6 courses tuned D, A, D, G, B, E, A, D, G, G, B, E, A, D, G, that we may call Baroque mandolin, and always played with fingerstyle, never with a plectrum until the second half of the 18th century. At this point, all such instruments were strung with gut strings. Vinaggiere. First metal string mandolins. The first evidence of modern metal string mandolins is from literature regarding popular Italian players who travel through Europe teaching and giving concerts. Notable are Signor Leone and Giovanni Battista Gervasia, who traveled widely between 1750 and 1810. This, with the records gleaned from the Italian Vinaggiere family of luthiers in Naples, Italy, led some musicologists to believe that the modern steel string mandolins were developed in Naples by the Vinaggiere family. There is confusion currently as to the name of the eldest Vinaggiere luthier who first ran the shop. His name has been put forth as Gennaro Vinaggiere and Dick Vinaggiere. His son Antonio Vinaggiere was active c. 1734 to c. 1796. An early extant example of a mandolin is one built by Antonio Vinaggiere in 1759, which resides at the University of Edinburgh. Another is by Giuseppe Vinaggiere, built in 1893, is also at the University of Edinburgh. The earliest extant mandolin was built in 1744 by Antonio's son, Gaetano Vinaggiere. It resides in the Conservatoire Royal de Musique in Brussels, Belgium. Family mandolin modified to create Neapolitan mandolin. Gaetano's son, Pasquale Vinaggiere, modernized the mandolin, adding features, creating the Neapolitan mandolin c. 1835. Pasquale remodeled, raised and extended the fingerboard to 17 frets, introduced stronger wire strings made of high-tension steel and substituted a machine head for the friction tuning pegs then standard. The new wire strings required that he strengthened the mandolin's body, and he deepened the mandolin's bowl, giving the tonal quality more resonance. Callas, Imburger and others. Other luthiers who built mandolins included Raffaele Callas in Naples, Luigi Imburger in Rome and Arpino, the Ferrari family in Rome, and De Santi in Rome. The Neapolitan style of mandolin construction was adopted and developed by others, notably in Rome, giving two distinct but similar types of mandolin, Neapolitan and Roman. Rising and falling fortunes. First wave. The transition from the mandolino to the mandolin began around 1744 with the designing of the metal string mandolin by the Vinaggia family. 3 brass strings and 1 of gut, using friction tuning pegs on a fingerboard that sat flush with the sound table. The mandolin grew in popularity over the next 60 years, in the streets where it was used by young men courting and by street musicians, and in the concert hall. After the Napoleonic Wars of 1815, however, its popularity began to fall. The 19th century produced some prominent players, including Bartolomeo Ortolazzi of Venice and Pietro Vimercati. However, professional virtuosity was in decline, and the mandolin music changed as the mandolin became a folk instrument. The large repertoire of notated instrumental music for the mandolino and the mandolin was completely forgotten. The export market for mandolins from Italy dried up around 1815, and when Carmine de Laurentiis wrote a mandolin method in 1874, the Music World magazine wrote that the mandolin was out of date. Salvador Leonardi mentioned this decline in his 1921 book, Methode pour Banjoli now Mandolin Banjo, saying that the mandolin had been declining in popularity from previous times. It was during this slump in popularity that Pasquale Vinaggia made his modifications to the instrument that his family made for generations, creating the Neapolitan mandolin. The mandolin was largely forgotten outside of Italy by that point, but the stage was set for it to become known again, starting with the Paris Exposition in 1878. Second wave. The golden age of mandolins. Beginning with the Paris Exposition of 1878, the instrument's popularity rebounded. The exposition was one of many stops for a popular new performing group, the Estudiantes Españoles. They danced and played guitars, violins and the bandaria, which became confused with the mandolin, along with the energy and awareness created by the day's hit sensation. A wave of Italian mandolinists traveled Europe in the 1880s and 1890s and in the United States by the mid-1880s, playing and teaching their instrument. The instrument's popularity continued to increase during the 1890s, and mandolin popularity was at its height in early years of the 20th century. Thousands were taking up the instrument as a pastime, and it became an instrument of society, taken up by young men and women. Mandolin orchestras were formed worldwide, incorporating not only the mandolin family of instruments but also guitars, double basses and zithers. That era has come to be known as the Golden Age of the mandolin. The term is used online by mandolin enthusiasts to name the time period when the mandolin had become popular, when mandolin orchestras were being organized worldwide, and new and high-quality instruments were increasingly common. After the First World War, the instrument's popularity again fell, although gradually. Reasons cited included the rise of jazz, for which the instrument was too quiet. Also, the changing pace of life was cited, as people became busier and as modern conveniences competed with learning to play an instrument for fun. Aftermath. The second decline was not as complete as the first. Thousands of people had learned to play the instrument. Even as the second wave of mandolin popularity declined in the early 20th century, new versions of the mandolin began to be used in new forms of music. Luthiers created the resonator mandolin, the flat-back mandolin, the carved-top or arch-top mandolin, the mandolin banjo and the electric mandolin. Musicians began playing it in Celtic, bluegrass, jazz and rock and roll styles, and classical too. Construction. Mandolins have a body which acts as a resonator attached to a neck. The resonating body may be shaped as a bowl or a box. Traditional Italian mandolins, such as the Neapolitan mandolin, meet the neck bowl description. The neck box instruments include the carved-top mandolins and the flat-back mandolins. Strings run between mechanical tuning machines at the top of the neck to a tailpiece that anchors the other end of the strings. The strings are suspended over the neck and soundboard and pass over a floating bridge. The bridge is kept in contact with the soundboard by the downward pressure from the strings. The neck is either flat or has a slight radius, and is covered with a fingerboard with frets. The action of the strings on the bridge causes the soundboard to vibrate, producing sound. Like any plucked instrument, mandolin notes decay to silence rather than sound out continuously as with a bowed note on a violin, and mandolin notes decay faster than larger stringed instruments like the guitar. This encourages the use of tremolo to create sustained notes or chords. The mandolin's paired strings facilitate this technique. The plectrum strikes each of a pair of strings alternately, providing a more full and continuous sound than a single string would. Various design variations and amplification techniques have been used to make mandolins comparable in volume with louder instruments and orchestras, including the creation of mandolin banjo hybrid with the louder banjo, adding metal resonators to make a resonator mandolin, and amplifying electric mandolins through amplifiers. Tuning. A variety of different tunings are used. Usually, courses of two adjacent strings are tuned in unison. The most common tuning by far, G3D4A for E5, is the same as violin tuning, fourth course, G3. Third course, D4, second course, A4, first course, E5. Note that the numbers of Hz shown above assume a 440 Hz A standard in most parts of the Western world. Some players use up to 10 Hz above or below 440, mainly outside of the United States. Other tunings exist, including cross-tunings, in which the usually doubled string runs are tuned to different pitches. Additionally, guitarists may sometimes tune a mandolin to mimic a portion of the intervals on a standard guitar tuning to achieve familiar fretting patterns. Mandolin family. Soprano. The mandolin is the soprano member of the mandolin family, as the violin is the soprano member of the violin family. Like the violin, its scale length is typically about 13 inches. Modern American mandolins modeled after Gibson's have a longer scale, about 13�৭". The strings in each of its double-strung courses are tuned in unison, and the courses use the same tuning as the violin, G3D4A for E5. The piccolo soprano mandolin is a rare member of the family, tuned 1 octave above the mandola and 1/4 above the mandolin, the same relation as that of the piccolo soprano violin to the violin and viola. One model was manufactured by the Leon and Amp Keeley Company under the Leland brand. A handful of contemporary luthiers built piccolo mandolins. Its scale length is typically about 9.5 inches. Alto. The mandola, termed the tenor mandola in Britain and Ireland, and leola or alto mandolin in continental Europe, which is tuned to a fifth below the mandolin, in the same relationship as that of the viola to the violin. Some also call this instrument the alto mandola. Its scale length is typically about 16.5 inches. It is normally tuned like a viola, C3 G3 D4 A4. 10 of the octave mandolin, termed the octave mandola in Britain and Ireland and mandola in continental Europe, is tuned an octave below the mandolin, G2 D3 A3 E4. Its relationship to the mandolin is that of the tenor violin to the violin. Octave mandolin scale length is typically about 20 inches, although instruments with scales as short as 17 inches or as long as 21 inches are not unknown. The Irish bouzouki is also considered a member of the mandolin family, although derived from the Greek bouzouki. It is constructed like a flat-backed mandolin and uses fifth-based tunings, most often G2 D3 A3 E4, in which case it essentially functions as an octave mandolin. Common alternate tunings include G2 D3 A3 D4, A2 D3 A3 D4 or A2 D3 A3 E4. Although the Irish bouzouki's bass course pairs are most often tuned in unison, on some instruments one of each pair is replaced with a lighter string and tuned in octaves, in the fashion of the 12-string guitar, while occupying the same range as the octave mandolin, octave mandola. The Irish bouzouki is theoretically distinguished from the former instrument by its longer scale length, typically from 22 inches to 24 inches, although scales as long as 26 inches, which is the usual Greek bouzouki scale, are not unknown. In modern usage, however, the terms octave mandolin and Irish bouzouki are often used interchangeably to refer to the same instrument. The modern chiton may also be loosely included in an extended mandolin family. It resembles the flat-back mandolins but predates them, dating back to the Renaissance. It is typically a 5-course instrument having a scale length between 20 inches and 22 inches. The instrument is most often tuned to either D2 G2 D3 A3 D4 or G2 D3 A3 D4 A4, and is essentially an octave mandola with a 5th course at either the top or the bottom of its range. Some luthiers, such as Stefan Sobel, also refer to the octave mandola or a shorter scaled Irish bouzouki as a chiton, irrespective of whether it has 4 or 5 courses. Relatives of the chiton, which might also be loosely linked to the mandolins, include the 6-course 12-string Portuguese guitar and the 5-course 9-string waltz. Baritone bass. The mandolin was a Baroque member of the mandolin family in the bass range that was surpassed by the mandocello, built as part of the Neapolitan mandolin family. The mandocello, which is classically tuned to an octave plus a 5th below the mandolin, in the same relationship as that of the cello to the violin, C2 G2 D3 A3. Its scale length is typically about 25 inches. A typical violoncello scale is 27 inches. The Greek leuto alagouto is similar to a mandocello, ordinarily tuned C3, C2 G3, G2 D3, D3 A3, A3, with half of each pair of the lower 2 courses being tuned an octave high on a lighter gauge string. The body is a staved bowl, the saddle less bridge glued to the flat face like most ouds and lutes, with mechanical tuners, steel strings, and tied guard frets. Modern leutos, as played on Crete, have the entire lower course tuned to C3, and re-entrant octave above the expected low C. Its scale length is typically about 28 inches. Contrabass. The mandobass most frequently has 4 single strings, rather than double courses, and is tuned in fourths like a double bass or an acoustic bass guitar, E1 A1 D2 G2. These were made by the Gibson Company in the early 20th century, but appear to have never been very common. A smaller scale 4-string mandobass, usually tuned in fifths G1, D2, A2, E2, was produced, which, though not as resonant as the larger instrument, was often preferred by players as easier to handle and more portable. Reportedly, however, most mandolin orchestras preferred to use the ordinary double bass, rather than a specialized mandolin family instrument. Callas and other Italian makers predating Gibson also made mandolin basses. A relatively rare 8-string mandobass, or tremolo bass, also exists with double courses like the rest of the mandolin family, and is tuned either G1, D2, A2, E3, 2 octaves lower than the mandolin, or C1, G1, D2, A2, 2 octaves below the mandola.